Hello, everyone, and welcome to China's Westward footprint in Central and Eastern Europe. This is an event produced in partnership with Coda Story and the Center for European Policy Analysis, or CEPA. I'm Caitlin Thompson. I'm a reporter at Coda Story and the audience lead. If you're not familiar with Coda, we are a global newsroom dedicated to providing context and continuity on the underlying currents that are shaping our world and dominating our politics and our lives. So we cover disinformation, the war on science, and the ways tech fuels authoritarianism. You can read our reporting at codastory.com. A few housekeeping things before we jump into our conversation with Edward Lucas today. Just to note, we are recording this conversation and we're going to post it online later. Throughout the event, feel free to drop any questions into the chat and we'll answer them as we go along. So with that, let's get right to it. I'm joined today by Edward Lucas. Edward is a longtime foreign correspondent who was formerly the senior editor at The Economist. Today, he's a senior fellow at CEPA, the Center for European Policy Analysis. For the last year, Edward has been tracking China's westward influence for China Influence Monitor. This is a newsletter that was produced in partnership with Coda Story and CEPA. The newsletter is not publishing at its regular cadence these days, but don't worry, we're going to get lots of Edward's insights today, depending on what time zone you're in. So with all that in mind, that's what we're here to talk about today, China's influence in Central and Eastern Europe. Edward, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks so much, and greetings from a cold, grey December in London. And I just want to say, first of all, it's been such fun over the last year and a bit working with Coda Story. It was a really happy collaboration. I loved being edited by Natalia, and I often don't love being edited, but Natalia, your boss and the co-founder of Coda Story, is just a world-class editor, and she always, however good I thought I was, she was able to improve it. So that was great. It was also great working with the rest of the staff because you've got such breadth and insight. I don't know anyone else who would be able to provide a Arabic language, no, a Persian language channel from Saudi Arabia reporting on Chinese influence in Tajikistan, and to be able to get that tweet, see the significance of it, get it translated, and then be able to write a paragraph about China's influence in Central Asia. I thought that epitomized the kind of quirky breadth and genius of the whole Coda operation. So it's been great, and and it was a well worthwhile. And I think the best illustration of our success is that so many people have piled into the space now. Particularly when we started, we were pretty much the only newsletter doing it. By the time we finished, there were at least 4, and most of them running with full-time staff, whereas with Coda Story, with ours, it was just 1 day a week for me and a few hours from the rest of you. So I think we were vindicated by that, and it was great.
Yeah, we certainly were onto something, weren't we? Edward, that's very, very kind of you. Thank you. I will say the partnership with you and with CEPA has been wonderful for Coda as well. And I personally have learned so much from reading this newsletter. So for those of you who are joining the event and may not be familiar, this newsletter was a co-production between Coda Story and CEPA. The first edition was October 8th, 2020. We published the most recent edition at the end of July. Edward, a lot has happened since the last newsletter went out, and I have some questions on very specific things, but I know you have a presentation. Do you want to catch us up on what's happened? What's been happening recently?
So I just imagined that I was getting ready to do the China Influence Monitor again, as was so often the case on Wednesday mornings, and what I would pull together. And it was very interesting. I just want to show you I'm going to now test the outer limits of the technological envelope and see if I can, so this is just a reminder that Mr. Putin is, as always, watching us. And let's go back to the beginning. So wolf warriors and how to annoy them. And I think this was the key feature of our newsletter, is that we were relentlessly mocking the pompous wooden-nibbed, cloth-tongued Chinese officials who, under such strict instructions from home to be wolf warriors, to be the diplomatic equivalent of the Chinese Rambo, who is the wolf warrior of the eponymous films. And the more splenetic they were, the more counterproductive they were. And I think that was the great feature of our newsletter, is that we called them out, not just for defending dictatorship and attacking democracy, but for doing it in such a clumsy and counterproductive way. So we annoyed them. And I'm now going to go to my presentation.
Edward, if you don't mind, can I ask you to quickly define what you mean by wolf warriors? For somebody who hasn't come across that term before, what do you
Wolf
mean?
Warrior and Wolf Warrior 2 are very much like the Rambo films. They are about a disgraced foreign special forces soldier who redeems himself, in this case in Africa, in Wolf Warrior 2. And they're done with a kind of unself-conscious colonialism, which I think you saw in British films perhaps in the 1950s. And at one point in Wolf Warrior 2, the Africans literally dance in gratitude to the wolf warrior for defending them. And so I was very struck. I've written quite a bit about the significance of these films, which are immensely successful in China. But the instruction from Beijing went out to the Chinese embassy officials, I hesitate to call them diplomats, to adopt this sort of take no prisoners, highly confrontational stance in their diplomacy. And we know privately some diplomats are very hesitant about this, because being really obnoxious about your home country and picking on every tiny little area in media, academia, publishing, or wherever where something happens that China doesn't like, maybe is counterproductive, but it reflects what the term I've coined is hegemonic discourse control, the idea that any discussion of China anywhere in the world is China's business, whether it's in a Western newspaper or in a publishing house or university or an NGO or whatever. And this is very much the new line coming out. So if you're a university and you have a Tibet society and they try and do something, and we'll see in my presentation examples of some of the things that have been going on quite recently. And so that is wolf warrior diplomacy, and that's why we gave a wolf warrior prize.
Gotcha. Okay, that's really helpful. Thank you so much. I have a couple more follow-up questions, but I'm curious what you found that you want to share with us.
So I think one of the big things was and it was already there earlier on in the year, and we highlighted the significance in Lithuania of the party that's now the government having an election platform which says we believe in democracy from Belarus to Taiwan. And that's really been a huge story in the last few months, the Lithuanians making good on their promise to open a Taiwanese office in Vilnius. And the wildly counterproductive Chinese reaction to this. And obviously China has this neurotic approach to Taiwan. They don't want any political contacts at all. And in a way, this makes them open to a rather enjoyable form of asymmetric warfare. That all you have to do is to say, actually, I think Taiwan's a country. And the Chinese, mainland Chinese, will devote a huge amount of effort to trying to explain that you're wrong, that nobody at all thinks that, but also by saying it, it's extremely dangerous. And you see absurd things of demanding that universities abide by a one China policy when the university can't, obviously can't have the one China policy. So Taiwan is a very big deal, and Lithuania's stance on that has been very big. But we see this spreading. We've seen a Baltic states delegation, all three countries going to Taiwan. That's got the mainland Chinese tied up in knots. And these are just some snapshots from Google, from Google News. We've also seen the continued decay of the 16+1, which used to be 17+1, which is China's framework cooperation venture for bringing in the so-called East European countries. And Lithuania stormed out, having organized a boycott back in January. And of the 6 countries that took part in that boycott that didn't send a president or prime minister as instructed by Xi Jinping to the 16+1 summit, but we now see the continued decay of this. Estonia not being, say, won't go to the summit. The Czechs also deserve a bit of mention. The Czechs broke this. Almost the first story we wrote, I think, when we were still in pilot mode, was about Miloš Vystrčil, the Czech Speaker of the Senate, going with a 90-strong delegation to Taiwan in the summer of 2020. And this has continued, and Slovakia is now following suit. So there's really quite a lot of movement there. And the Czechs, the wonderful Czech think tank, the Centre for European Values, has set up an office in Taiwan. If you follow Jakub Janda on Twitter, you can see what an amazing success that's been.
Yeah.
And I noticed that what used to be seen as really quite freakish, and when I said I'm interested in the way in which China is exerting influence in Eastern Europe and not really getting anywhere, and East European countries' efforts to team up with, to do things with Taiwan, this seemed pretty niche, and this was more niche than my interests in things like the Arctic or the historiography of the Russian Civil War. And it's now become really mainstream. And I thought this piece in The Economist quite recently, I thought epitomized this. It shows that there's a real, I didn't particularly agree with the piece, but it showed that this topic's become mainstream. I think it's worth saying there are places where China's still got its feet firmly under the table, and that's particularly in ex-Yugoslavia. And here's just a few, three stories from ex-Yugoslavia, and that is perhaps in Bosnia, which is already very fragile from a geopolitical point of view. The Chinese are still there, and the Montenegrins continue to warn about Chinese influence. But the big picture is very much that the world is waking up. And I've just noticed a couple of things here. We've got the MI6 chief who gave a speech last week about the danger from China, calling out China as a threat, particularly Chinese activities in other countries, echoed now by our Foreign Secretary Liz Truss. The new government in Germany taking this supposedly seriously. We'll look forward to that. France continuing to be very, moving very firmly in the hawkish direction. And other countries, and here's just a couple of examples of what we would have been highlighting had we done it. The lovely Italian city of Brescia wanted to have an exhibition by the Chinese-Australian dissident artist Baudichal, and the Chinese tried to stop it. And of course, that was just lots of highly welcome free publicity for an art gallery. I mean, you couldn't imagine anything better than having a country of 1.4 billion people telling everybody not to go to your art exhibition. It's just like having the...
very good. Starts to be very, now it's an invite that I covet, and now that I really want to go, because I want to see what the fuss is about.
Yeah. So I think I'll pretty much wind up there. We continue to see these sort of acquisitions, this China taking control of the Italian military drone manufacturer was one thing. And so the other soft spot, of course, is Cyprus, which really is very worrying. This was my effort from a couple of weeks ago. I know from last week, actually, about British worries about the China in the Commonwealth, with a particularly spectacular picture of the PLA march past there. Yeah. So I continue to do my bit. The main problem is, as I'll leave you with this picture, is the West is still in such disarray. Even though President Trump has gone, the splits in the West that were exemplified at that summit remain. I'll leave you with Mr. Putin.
Fantastic. That's a great overview. Thank you so much, Edward. And you touched on a lot of things that I want to talk to you about. Specifically, I want to come back to Lithuania. But I guess let's start really kind of the ground level here. What does China want from Eastern and Central Europe? What are China's goals in the region?
One of the things we've discovered this year is that the headlines are often much more exciting than the articles. I've been doing a lot for CEPA on this, and we looked particularly at, in a big report called, I think, Partnership Without Substance, looking at Chinese-Russian relations in the region that we used to call Eastern Europe, although I don't like that term. And again, what we found was that there was a lot of sort of superficial involvement. So an industrial park in Belarus, for example, these infrastructure projects in the Western Balkans, some a university in Hungary, the 17 or then 16+1. But when you scratch below the surface, there was actually much less going on the infrastructure projects that exist as lines on the map rather than actual steel and concrete being poured. There are a few things. I think what China wants is to be able to break EU diplomatic unity. And that's clearly a thing. Hungary doesn't vote with the EU on human rights things. They didn't turn up, for example, when the Lithuanian ambassador, Diana Mickiewicz, who I hope may even be on this call, when she was being very badly treated in Beijing, and all the EU envoys got together, I think, for her to send her off for her when she was expelled, except the Hungarians. And I think possibly the Cypriots weren't there either. But Hungary is a hole in the wall, and that's the result of partly Orban's own determination to try and, as we say in British English, cock a snook. I don't know how that translates into American. Thumb his nose, give the finger to EU diplomacy. But he does have an effect. So that's there. There's no doubt about that. But on so many other things, where was China when Belarus was in trouble? Nowhere. When the Lithuanians picked on China, then suddenly China was jumping all over Lithuania. But in the earlier point, none of Belarus's extensive headline diplomacy with China seems to have paid off very much. So below the surface, there's often a lot less than you think. And I think that the trend in the EU is much more now towards dealing with China at 27, where the EU has real weight. And they're aware that this divide and rule strategy that China pursues, although it isn't terribly successful, is certainly worth countering.
So it sounds like one of the biggest goals in the regions is to divide Europe politically and cause these rifts between these countries. So in light of that, is that the motivation behind what used to be the 17+1, but is now, because, as you mentioned, Lithuania left, now the 16+1 framework for collaboration between some European countries and China? Can you explain a little bit what that framework is and how it helps China in pursuit of that goal to divide European allies?
Yeah, I mean, the 17+1 started off with quite a fanfare. And it was seen as that China's this tremendously promising market, and this is a chance for the so-called East European countries to get a special privileged relationship when it comes to trade and investment, maybe to get some cultural goodies, and perhaps be treated as the so-called East Europeans than they would be if they were trying to negotiate via the EU. And this has basically been a failure, partly because China just really, really sucks at multilateralism. They are not good at it. It doesn't work very well.
Not their specialty, no.
None of the, I mean, a lot of the 17+1 things, like the 17+1 think tank network, the website didn't work. I'm not sure it's up again, but for ages, the so-called website, which was called ChinaCE.org, I think it was, just didn't work. The offices in various ministries that were set up were so low profile. There may have been some espionage or some of this long-term building up personal connections going on. The infrastructure offering was really quite disappointing outside some highly specific examples in the Western Balkans. And once the Lithuanians started the pushback and said, look, we've been instructed to send our presidents, prime ministers, we don't like that. That was quite successful. I think the other thing is that as soon as it became clear that the United States is really seriously worried about China, for countries in the region that want whose security relationship with the United States is really important, it becomes very important not to be seen as soft on China. And so the Lithuanians, although they've taken some economic hits from their Taiwan policy, I would argue have benefited substantially in Washington from being the kind of the model ally, the one country in the whole of Europe who seemed willing, absolutely full blast, to stand up to mainland China. So I think that as the geopolitics shifted, China's own weakness, the lack of substance in the whole thing, meant that to use an Americanism, this turned into a bit of a nothing burger.
So we have a question from the chat that I want to jump to, because it ties into the point that you made a little bit ago about infrastructure projects in Central and Eastern Europe, and the way that China is maneuvering those into influence both economically and politically. So this is a question from Joseph. how will China utilize the Budapest-Belgrade railway moving forward? And in a more general sense, how will China monopolize and leverage the other railway routes that it's been financing? What's your take on that?
The idea that the Budapest to Belgrade railway is going to be utilized is, to put it politely, somewhere in the future. And I think we've seen some construction contracts going out in, particularly in Hungary, with the associated political controversy because of the extraordinary way in which Prime Minister Orban's best friend seemed to have such extraordinary luck in winning big government contracts. And I'm not booking my ticket on that railway anytime soon. I think there's also be questions about whether the EU sort of homes in on that and says, well, actually, we can build this railway with in a better way, or they maybe start asking some questions about it from a regulatory point of view. So I'm not, it is a flagship project, but the flagship is still firmly in the harbour, and I would say not ready to set sail. I think my big worry about infrastructure is not so much in this part of the world, is not that China is getting the port or the airfield, or the power grid, the way that we do worry in some African and perhaps soon Latin American and Asian countries. I'm more worried about their ability to collect data. And this is one of the things that the chief of MI6, Britain's Secret Intelligence Service, said in his speech last week, is that China's collecting data all over the world. And we don't quite know what they're doing with it. They're using it to inform their own decision-making. They may be using it for their own counterintelligence work. So it becomes much harder for Western intelligence officers to travel to countries that previously would have been seen quite as quite friendly. Because if you go there, your face, your mobile phone, your payment data and everything else is hoovered up as you pass through Chinese infrastructure. And people say, actually, that's not Mr. Bond of Universal Export. That's Commander James Bond of that's 007. What's he doing here? Yeah. And so there's a lot of worry about that. And I think that for now, my chief worry about all Chinese presence, economic presence in Europe is about is on the sort of cyber and data side rather than on the exerting real monopoly power. I would also add that where they have got some infrastructure links, they've been willing to sacrifice them very quickly for political ends. So the first thing they did with Lithuania was say no more trains, which isn't great if you're trying to make yourself into the sort of east-west railway axis.
So when you're talking about collecting data, that's, I guess, where the concern hinges with Huawei and Chinese influence in 5G. Is that kind of what you're getting at?
Huawei is one example of this, and I think the Lithuanians were commendable when they found out that one of the most common Chinese-made phones supplied in Lithuania actually has a kill switch built into the software, which deletes anything that contains the taboo words. I think it's Taiwan, Tiananmen Square, Tibet, and so on. And the Chinese said, "Oh, but this is a kill switch which is not activated in European markets." And the Lithuanians literally said, "If you own one of these Xiaomi phones, throw it in the bin." So that was a spectacular example of how hegemonic discourse control works. That your computer simply wouldn't allow you, or your digital device wouldn't allow you to send or receive a message containing one of the offending terms. I'm more worried about personal data, that they start knowing who's meeting whom. And although you might think this is just with a billion people in the West, this is an unmanageable swamp of data. The advantages in AI that they have, which is I think something that our security and intelligence services are very worried about, means that they have the ability to trawl through vast amounts of data. On looking, for example, on things like how many people in this crowd don't have mobile phones. And then saying, well, that's interesting. The people who don't have mobile phones probably don't have them for a reason. Let's then run their faces through other facial recognition software and see if we can work out who they are. And then they say, oh, that's interesting. Caitlin Thompson is in a a street in Cairo without her mobile phone. What's she doing there? And and that might be the is that you're meeting some Chinese distant contact there, and you've left your mobile phone at home in the hope that you won't be tracked by the Chinese. But in fact, the fact you've done that means they can find you. So there's all these sort of tricks you can do with enormous data sets in spotting either anomalies or patterns. And an anomaly is in fact the inverse of a pattern. And we don't really know what they're up to, but we do worry about it.
That's remarkable. And I like the example of the kill switch, because we know China has so many ways of influencing discourse abroad, disinformation campaigns, and as you mentioned, wolf warrior diplomats, but that's a whole other level. That's really quite interesting. So let's talk about where China has found some allies in the region. So you mentioned Bosnia and Cyprus. For countries in Central and Eastern Europe, particularly smaller ones, particularly those who have a contentious relationship with Russia, China seems to be seen as the strategic alternative. What do you have to countries, or what do you have to say to countries who fall into that narrative? And is it a false alternative? Particularly for countries like Ukraine, who are very concerned about Russia, want to move closer to the West. Is China a reasonable alternative?
Well, I think basically no. And I mean, I think if you're trying to diversify your trade away from Russia in a hurry, and if you say, we get down from 45% trade with Russia and 0% with China to 5% with China and 40% with Russia, you could make the argument then that it's the more widely your trade is diversified among countries that can hurt you, the better, because you're spreading your risk. Ideally, you would trade mainly with countries that are friendly, because that would be obviously happy and good. But the world's not really like that. I think that there's not much. There's no clear example of a country that's benefited from its difficult relations with Russia being ameliorated by good relations with China. Lukashenko is probably the standout example, where to annoy Putin, he made some sort of performative pro-Chinese moves and put China, the language at Minsk airport, which I've never seen. I'm on their visa blacklist, but if I did go to Minsk, I would be able to see the Chinese, Russian, and English signs there. And there's this much talked about industrial park outside Minsk, but none of it adds up to a row of beans when it comes to important stuff. I think Ukraine was bet quite heavily on China, and the Americans were quite right to say to the Ukrainians, watch out, and particularly the Motor Sikh aviation plant. It was important that that didn't end up in Chinese hands from a technology transfer point of view. So I think that it's, for every country in the region, you should say proceed with caution. Now, obviously, Germany has gone way overboard with its appalling dependence, particularly Volkswagen in occupied East Turkestan, which the Chinese call Xinjiang. The Germans have gone way beyond anyone in terms of trade investment dependence on China. And so East Europeans can be justified in saying, why are you beating us up when look what the Germans have done, to which my argument would be, don't follow the German example, look where it's got them. So I think, but I don't see, there's two naive approaches here. One is to say, balance Russia against China, and the other is to say, Russia and China are going to fight over Eastern Europe, and both of these are categorically untrue. There is no sign of Russian-Chinese friction anywhere in the region, and there's no sign that you can balance China against Russia, or for that matter, Russia against China.
That's very interesting. And there's two questions from the chat that I want to address that are on that topic. For our listeners, you're doing a great job with the questions. Keep them coming. We'll go through as many as we can. I've got two questions for you, Edward. One is from Jeff. How will China try to link Ukraine with the Belt and Road Initiative? And then I've got another question from Philip along those same lines. Does China actually have friends in Europe in the same way that Russia does? you want to take a stab at those two questions?
Yes, I mean, I'm not really sure whether Russia has friends in Europe. I mean, I don't think there's any sort of, I mean, there are countries in Europe that have genuine deep ties of philosophical, cultural, historical, personal, emotional. I mean, I feel them myself, and I really mind about what's happening in the countries that I know well. And I'm not sure there's any country where you could, even the supposedly pro-Russian ones like Cyprus, where there's a real, and if you read Dimitar Bechev's book on the Western Balkans, even the countries, the political parties of the Western Balkans that came to be pro-Russian, if you scratch below the surface, it turns out they'd never been to Russia in their lives. They know nothing about Russia. It's more of a sort of symbolic thing rather than a real thing. I think that the Belt and Road Initiative is running out of money. And what I'm hearing from people who know China much better than me is that there's some resistance to this. China needs to spend a lot of money at home. They've splurged money on the BRI. It hasn't been tremendously successful, and it's attracting quite a lot of foreign policy grief. So I think that we are, I would be surprised if it accelerated, and I think we may see a bit of drawing back, and at least until the sort of current crisis is over. And I don't think that there's any, I think you've got individual bits in European societies that are pro-Chinese, often for reasons of sort of deep personal greed and ambition. So you might point to a particular college at an Oxford or Cambridge University, or to a particular industry, or a particular think tank, or a particular something else that's really made a lot of money out of China and is very keen to continue to be patronized. And they are sort of friends of China in the same way that my dog is friends with me because I feed it. But it's not, I just think there's no counterpart to what we have with the Atlantic Alliance, the Swedish-Finnish friendship, the French-German rapprochement, or even Visegrad. I mean, there's nothing on those close on those lines.
So what about small countries who want to move closer to the West and potentially are not EU countries right now, but want to be, or at least some part of their political force wants to be? I'm thinking right now of Ukraine, of Georgia. Is it feasible but at the same time, these countries potentially have a difficult time getting investment from the West and from the EU. Is it feasible for them to turn down Chinese investment? And is it a concern? How does that concern about Chinese influence and Chinese economic influence wrap into that when you deal with these kind of complicated economic and political structures?
I think you've got to always look at gift horses in the mouth, because they may be not quite as good as they seem. And I think if you're really a really poor bit of the Western Balkans, then maybe, and someone comes along and says, I'll buy your copper plant, and otherwise it's going to go bust and 6,000 people are going to lose their jobs, to take the example from Serbia. And that sounds great. And then it turns out that the environmental destruction is absolutely dreadful. And so I mean, it's hard to find any example of any Chinese industrial or infrastructure investment in Eastern Europe, to use the phrase, where people say, gosh, that was great, let's go back and do it again. There's either you've got grief with the Americans, or you've got environmental grief, or it's taking too long, or there's corruption around it, or locals dissatisfied. But there's no standout success story. And I understand that in Africa, there are at least some, in African countries, there are at least some projects on say, well, that was great, we'd never have built it without the Chinese. Good. Though I would always want to look, being a journalist, I'd want to look below the bonnet and just check that. But if you're, and I think the other thing is there is no shortage of money at the moment. If you have a good investment project, there is so much multilateral finance available, because we've been printing money like crazy. So what are the projects that are so great that China's aching to fund them, but are not quite great enough that you can't get EBRD, EIB, World Bank, or private sector money to fund them. And the usual answer is there are projects that involve a degree of corruption, and that's why the West won't fund them, but the Chinese will, and that's perhaps not a good reason for building them.
Yeah, that is really interesting. If you're Western money comes with strings attached, things to tackle in the world of corruption, and Chinese money, to my understanding, comes with fewer strings. And so the question being, does that lead to, I guess, it's not as strong an incentive to deal with your corruption issues if you know you can get money from elsewhere. So there's a question. I can let you, if you want to respond to my kind of meandering thought, go for it. But I've got some questions for you.
I would just say that the idea is that only the Chinese will give a deal that will make me rich, is not perhaps the best selling point.
Yeah, that's fair enough. So there's a question from Piotr that I think is really interesting, and I'm curious to hear your answer. How do you assess the scale and the scope of Chinese intelligence services and Chinese intelligence services actions within Central and Eastern Europe?
Well, there's lots of different targets here. And when one's talking about intelligence services, one always, it's a bit like saying, what do you think about screwdrivers or hammers? It's what they're being used for. Yeah. And I think that there's one big sort of slice of work, which is monitoring the diaspora. And we don't see very much of that. It's quite effective, quite brutal, happens often in, obviously in secret, but leaving very, very little way of the footprints. And just occasionally we have, the daughter of a jailed Chinese dissident says people come and stare through her windows. And I always hope that our counterintelligence people are on that, because presumably they are some kind of Chinese spy, and what are they doing wandering around Cambridge looking through people's windows? But that's one big slice, the sort of internal, because for them that it's rather like the FSB with the Russian diaspora. They regard that basically as being sort of, it's domestic, it just happens to be abroad. Then there's the sort of high-end political intelligence, and we see some traces of that because people get caught every now and again. It seems to me they're not. They are quite good at stealing. They're not very good at that, basically, and it's partly because they don't understand how our societies work. So if you don't understand how society works, it's hard to work out how you're going to target your recruitment and what questions you're going to ask them. I think the standout success is probably military intelligence on the technological side, where they've been quite effective, particularly in the United States, what one assumes in Europe, although we don't have so many military secrets in Europe because our militaries are not so advanced. But there's a bit of that, and occasionally we see stories of people being arrested. And I think there's the fourth is that they're very interested in what we think about them, and there's perhaps the most troubling and aggressive thing from what my sources tell me is their attempt to try and find out how much Western intelligence services know about China and to turn it around and stop it. And they've had some spectacular successes on this. If you Yahoo News, I think it was, maybe it was AP, and I read it on Yahoo News. Anyway, there was a devastating roll-up of just about every CIA agent in China was caught in a period of a few months, and most of them executed. And they seem to be getting, they put a huge amount of effort into trying to work out who in the West speaks Chinese, might be going to spy on China, might be involved in some sort of espionage thing, and then using this big data and AI to try and make sure that they know exactly who's where and what they're doing. The theft of the Office of Personnel Management records basically allowed them to play Spot the Spy throughout the entire American government apparatus. Every single security clearance for every single government official who doesn't work for the CIA was stolen in a very simple hack. And that meant that they, by a process of elimination, you could then work out who are the ones who do work for the CIA. So they've had some, I would say they're two sets ahead in the intelligence game and leading 4 games to nil in the third set. I'm really quite worried about it.
Yeah, that's straight out of a spy movie. That's intense. So on a slightly happier pivot, just noting the time, I would like to talk with you about the efforts to counter Chinese influence in Central and Eastern Europe. And you started this conversation by talking about Lithuania. Lithuania just opened the Taiwanese representative office in November, and they seem to have been really spearheading this counterweight to Chinese influence in the region. Are they managing to get some of the bigger European countries on board? France, Germany, UK?
I think that it's a bit like the Wizard of Oz. The Wizard of Oz looks tremendously impressive, and until you look behind the curtain, and the hegemonic discourse control and all these sort of Chinese mandated taboos are immensely impressive and quite scary, as long as everybody's obeying. You think, oh my goodness, am I really going to be the only country in Europe that doesn't do what the Chinese Communist Party insists that we do? And it can feel quite lonely. Now, the great thing about Lithuanians, and I really hope there are some Lithuanians on the call because they will now blush, is that Lithuanians are utterly unscared by this. They brought down this, and first of all, they used to be a superpower only a few hundred years ago, but they think in big global geopolitical terms, and they think in historical terms. 1863 is just around the corner for most Lithuanians, and that's at the heart of the tremendous help that they've been for the Belarusians. And they brought down the Soviet Union, and I was living in Lithuania in 1990, and every single foreign commentator and just about every foreign country said, "You're nuts, don't do this." And they said, "Thanks so much for your advice, we're now going to go and do it." And they did it. And less than 18 months later, the Soviet Union was on the dustbin of history. And so they are not, and they thought it through quite hard. I mean, it wasn't a sort of completely quixotic thing. They thought our foreign trade with China is actually quite low. We will benefit from trade with Taiwan, and the Americans, admittedly a bit belatedly, came in with a whacking great export credit and all sorts of diplomatic goodies and photo ops and so on, which supposedly helps. I think the weakness in the Lithuanian position is that the Lithuanian public is not fully behind this. The Lithuanian public is fully behind the policy on Russia and Belarus. It's much more skeptical about this. And so I think it's going to be important that Lithuania doesn't get punished. If Lithuania gets away with this and is vindicated, then you'll see other people feeling brave too. But at the moment, I think that in the the standout, most important thing is that the United States has broken the taboo by inviting Taiwan to the Summit of Democracies. And I think in the Netherlands, Dutch lawmakers have just said Taiwan should be part of the International Criminal Court. The Netherlands, we reported in China Influence Monitor, I think about a year ago, changed the name of their office in Taipei from economic, social and cultural office to Netherlands office Taiwan or something. And there was so there's lots of these sort of small shifts going on. The European Parliament's also very important. So I think so long as Lithuania isn't left twisting in the wind, other countries are going to increasingly find their grit and their guts and will follow suit. And then Lithuania will be in the happy position of having been vindicated again. And I did talk to a Lithuanian about this. I said, "Are you worried?" He said, "No, but if I was the Chinese Communist Party, I'd be worried." And I thought, wow, that's the spirit. They are 400 times larger, this country.
A lot of guts.
But the Lithuanians just do not appear to be the least frightened about this.
That's wonderful. So there's all of these new sorts of initiatives coming up in the past, in the recent past, that are European countries trying to come together to counter China's weight. I want to bring in a question from the chat from Monique, which is also one of the questions that I wanted to ask you. So thank you, Monique. What is the status of the 3 Cs initiative, and could it serve as a successful counterbalance to China's Belt and Road in Europe? And realistically, does it actually have potential? Let's start by just asking you to explain what the 3 Cs initiative is, and then we'll get into its impact.
I think the shortest description of the 3 Cs initiative is a nice idea, and which would be even nicer if it was working. It is that the 3 Cs in question are the Baltic, the Black Sea, and the Adriatic. It was launched, I think, 10 years ago with an idea to improve connectivity. And I've said I don't believe in the phrase Eastern Europe, but it is true that the part of Europe that used to be communist, whatever brand of communism that was, has worse connectivity than the rest of Europe on the whole. And broadband is better in Estonia than it is in Britain, but on the whole, you have the density of rail and road networks and of flights and so on is less good. And also pipelines tend to run east to west rather than north to south. So there's plenty of work to do on connectivity. And the idea of the Three Seas Initiative would be a Western-led connectivity framework. And it got off to a terrific start in Romania, I think about 7 or 8 years ago, with very high level attendance. And its implicit goal is to push back against China. It's a sort of counter to the 17+1. But it has numerous problems, all of which I've written about at very tedious length, but they include the lack of a proper legal infrastructure. So it's run as a sort of club out of the offices of the presidents of these countries, who in most cases are admirable people who don't have quite enough to do, mainly ceremonial roles. And but they don't have their hands on the purse strings, so they can't commit their governments to do things. There's no permanent secretariat. The promised financing has been far less than we expected. At the Munich Security Conference in February 2020, I think it was, Mike Pompeo promised $1 billion of American money for the Three Seas, and we haven't seen a dime. And not only that, when you ask the Americans, where's the money, they get very cross and say, don't ask these difficult questions. There's been a much smaller offer of a loan, but America's involvement has been deeply disappointing. And there's no momentum. We should be inviting more countries to join. It makes no sense not to have Ukraine in, for example. Now, I'm being a little bit harsh here. It may improve the Estonians did better than the Slovenes. The Slovene presidency was really a low point. The Slovenes improved a bit. The Bulgarians have improved a little bit more. Now it's the Latvians, and Latvians are extremely well organized and effective. So I hope that we'll get more there. But it's still, this is a nice car that's in the ditch and possibly doesn't have an engine. Once it's out of the ditch with an engine, the map shows a perfectly promising journey ahead of us, but we're not really anywhere near fulfilling the potential yet.
I'm surprised that's the first time I did that with the muting. Just being conscious of the time here, I want to pivot to Chinese disinformation in the region. And I want to wrap up our conversation in just a minute with, although keep your questions coming and we'll get through as many as we can. But I do want to kind of address the report that you did with CEPA on Chinese influence operations during the pandemic. But a quick question from the chat from Flo. Are there certain countries in the EU who buy into Chinese disinformation at higher rates? And should the EU be doing more to debunk it, especially around these taboo subjects like the Uyghurs or Taiwan?
Yes, and before I answer that, I would just say that I'm going to have to go on the dot at 3,
okay.
At 4 my time, because I've got to go and speak on illicit finance at Chatham House, which is where I am at the moment. But if anyone wants to reach me, my DMs are open on Twitter. You can just DM me and I'll try and answer as best I can. I think that the Chinese disinformation works spasmodically. All these things work when we muck things up. So when our response to the pandemic was absolutely deplorable at the beginning in Europe. We had borders going up all over Europe. We had vaccine hoarding. We had shortages of PPE. It was a real sort of, I was going to say dog eat dog. I don't know if that's quite the right metaphor, but anyway, there was a kind of sauve qui peut approach. And the Chinese waded in on that and said, we are shipping equipment into Italy because Italy's been abandoned by the European Union. And that worked a lot in the short term. It worked in Serbia, because the Serbs felt abandoned. And so there was some, and then with the vaccines, I think in Turkey, they offered vaccines and the Turks were pleased. So there'd been sort of one-off successes, but I think that it's still totally outweighed by the counter narrative, which is that China has, or mainland China has 1 million people in mind control camps, uses slave labor, despoils the environment, burns coal like crazy, lies about what it does, and kidnaps tennis stars when they complain about being raped. And that's, so it doesn't, so I think there's been sort of short-term tactical successes, but the strategic picture is one of China increasingly becoming seen as both nasty and scary. And that's pretty much true across all of Europe.
Okay. So I want to, on that note, bring us to the report that you just did with CEPA on Chinese and Russian influence operations during the pandemic. This is a report called Jabbed in the Back, mapping Chinese and Russian information operations during COVID-19. Can you tell us a little bit about your top findings? And I'm particularly curious about what you found about vaccine diplomacy.
Well, it's a huge subject. We're almost out of time, so I think
yep.
I would recommend people just read it. We did I hesitate to say my job was to provide a sort of overall framework and then spray some economists sub-editing around on the final text, and all the serious work was done by other people at CEPA who know far more about this than I do, and actually, for example, speak Chinese, which I don't. So I'm hesitant to take any of the credit for it, and I think someone just put a link in the chat. Mm-hmm. I suppose that one of the things we were keen to debunk, and we looked at, was whether there was a kind of systematic collaboration between Russia and China, because I said we have some naive, there's some naive hypotheses around, and one of the naive hypotheses around is that there's a kind of axis of evil between Moscow and Beijing, and they're working together to do down the West. And it's true that there is some cooperation, that's sort of tactical cooperation, and the example of that was probably the op-ed jointly written by the ambassadors of Russia and China to Washington. Wouldn't have passed the subbing threshold at Coda Story or at CEPA, but obviously they can learn to write better as they get older. But that was an example of cooperation on the sort of anti-democracy front. I think that the really big issue for me was that China tries to have a consistent and positive message. China will call out the West when it fails, and they'll say Lithuania is racist, or that Western democracy doesn't work. But the main thing they're trying to do is to say China rocks. We have a model that delivers economic, scientific, cultural success, and it just happens to work better than your Western-style democracy. And they try and stay broadly consistent within that. And there's a little bit of what we might call anti-science in their promotion of Chinese traditional medicine, for example, which don't think they're going to be winning a Nobel Prize for medicine for that anytime soon. But on the whole, and that contrasts so much with the Russian message, which is sort of gleefully inconsistent and gleefully negative. So the Russians will in the same breath be saying Sputnik's a great vaccine and vaccines give you cancer. And the COVID is going to kill you, or panic, your government's not going to protect you. And also, by the way, COVID's a hoax, and they're just using it to try and take away your supposed freedoms. And this farhood of falsehood, to use the wonderful term coined by one of our fellow think tanks, is sort of so baked into the Russian way of doing it that it's is hard to shift. I think that the other point I'd make is that all information operations always are part of wider influence operations. So there's always something else going on. And one has to look at, in China's case, they were doing real heavy lifting on PPE and on vaccines. And so they had something to crow about. And in Russia's case, it's usually part of some other divide and rule operation that they're doing, that the propaganda is this sort of accelerant or instigator for.
Mm-hmm. That's really interesting, and actually, I think a good place to leave it for today. Thank you, everybody, for all of your questions. We will do our best to find ways to answer them. As Edward mentioned, his DMs are open, but there may be other opportunities as well. Edward, thank you so much. I just want to take a second to give a shout out to all of the folks at CEPA who made this newsletter possible, as well as all of my colleagues at Coda Story. If you appreciated China Influence Monitor and appreciate Coda's journalism more broadly, please do consider becoming a Coda member. We are right in the middle of a membership drive that means that all support that you give to Coda will be matched through the end of the year. So it's a great time to show your support for nonprofit journalism and for Edward's amazing insights. Yes.
Can I just say, and I actually I'm extremely stingy. I don't normally donate things, but I did actually donate to Coda. So I really urge you to do it. I also want to say it's been so wonderful seeing so many people on the call who've been part of this, from Miriam Bryan, I see in Cyprus, who's indefatigable in sending me tips on Chinese behavior in China, in Cyprus. Peter Frankopan, I see, and if you haven't read his books, please do. I can't give everybody a shout out. Charles Burton, who has forgotten more about China than I will ever know. But I really felt I was part of a team of people who are all united, both by concern about what's going on, about knowledge about what's happening, determination to get up and do stuff, but also by great good humor, and it was just a pleasure working with you all, and I look forward to raising more money in future and doing something bigger and better and even more fun and even more annoying for the Chinese Communist Party.
Thank you so much, Edward. This was really interesting. Thank you to everybody who joined and for your wonderful questions and for your support of CEPA and of Coda. We'll leave it there for tonight. We will send the recording to everybody who attended so that you can listen all over again. Thank you, Edward. This was really, really interesting.